In 1900, John G. Robinson joined the Great Central Railway as locomotive and marine superintendent. By 1902, he became chief mechanical engineer, and he'd hold this position up until the grouping, when he'd step aside for a younger Nigel. By the time he was CME of the Great Central, he already had experience building locomotives. His first class for the GCR was a real success, being built in 1901 and some surviving into 1962. He also made the Great Central's 8K class. This is possibly one of the most successful locomotives to ever come out of the UK, and by come out, I mean they went abroad. Not all of his engines could be this successful, of course, but he had some real gems. His most famous class would be the Improved Director class of 1919. But before the Improved Directors came a string of not at all successful 460s. Today we'll be talking about one of those classes, the Great Central 9P, also known as the Lord Farringdon class. I'll be referring to them as the B3s as we get a little further down, as that's what they were classified by the LNER. Towards the end of Robinson's career, he made two 4-cylinder 460 classes, the 9P being the passenger version, and the 9Q a fast mixed traffic engine. Today's subject is the 9P. The first one appeared in 1917, a single engine. They had massive 6-foot 9-inch driving wheels, with 4 cylinders all 16 inches in diameter and fed by a boiler at 180 psi. Interestingly, all 4 cylinders ran on Stephenson valve gear, which was unusual for British 4 cylinders. As I previously mentioned, Robinson's 460s were not the most successful engines, and the 9Ps weren't great, but they were a step up from the Class 1s, which came before them. The first engine proved fast and powerful, but coal-hungry. This was a step up, however, and so a further batch of 5 was built in 1920. A problem all of the engines would suffer from is less than ideal pathways for steam, and on some occasions steam leaks, hurting their performance. The first of the class, at this time numbered 1169, was named Lord Farringdon, and allocated to Gorton, the batch of 5 being split between there and Immingham. Immingham at the time possessed very little passenger traffic, which implies the 9Ps were likely not good for it, but the Gorton engines did work stopping services for some time. After the grouping, the B3s would be moved to former Great Northern Territory, where they'd pull a new Pullman service between King's Cross and Leeds, replacing the aging Ivet Atlantics. Crew reviews were mixed. They were fast, strong, and likely had decent acceleration due to their 4-cylinder design. However, they were coal-hungry, really making their firemen earn their pay. They must not have done all that great here either, though, as in 1927 they were all reallocated, half to Neasden and half back to Gorton. The Neasden engines worked night trains, and the Gorton engines quickly moved to Immingham, where they'd pull midday passenger services. These duties would stay consistent until 1939. The Great Central had a larger loading gauge than the rest of the LNER, and when the grouping came around in 1923, some of the engines were cut down so they could go anywhere on the network. The 9Ps were not among these classes. However, as rebuilds came around, parts would be standardized, effectively shrinking the locomotive to better fit the mold. In 1929, Gresley rebuilt 2 engines with Caprotti valve gear in an attempt to reduce coal usage. I won't get into the science of it because I don't entirely understand it, but the result was the expansion of the steam being used more efficiently, less steam needed for the same work, and so less coal. The rebuilt locomotives, numbers 6166 and 6168, showed a 16% decrease in coal consumption, and so 2 more of the class would be rebuilt the same way, though much later. The second set of rebuilds happening in 1938 and 1939. The not rebuilt engines would be classified B3/1, and the rebuilt engines B3/2. The remaining B3/1s were meant to be rebuilt, but this was prevented by World War II. In 1939, the B3s would have their duties interrupted by increased war traffic. The increase in successful 460 designs and the success of Gresley's Pacifics meant these engines could be used in a more flexible manner. Throughout the war, they could be seen filling in for 440s that could no longer cope with increased traffic. In 1943, when Edward Thompson was working on standardizing the fleet, he attempted to rebuild a B3, resulting in B3/3. The rebuild brought on a shape much like his B1 class. The only things really saved in the rebuild were the bogie, driving wheels, and the back of the frames. The rebuild caused cracked frames. Cracking frames is possibly one of the worst things that can happen on a steam engine. No further engines were rebuilt. Interestingly, number 6166, the one rebuilt engine, lost its name in the rebuild due to having no good place for its plates. As for numbers, the first of the class had a different boiler than the rest, but as far as I can tell there was no difference in performance. The engines had a tractive effort of just over 25,000 pounds, and with driving wheels of 6 foot 9 inches. I do believe they could exceed 80 miles per hour in regular service. I've got a book here on my desk, LNER Steam by O.S. Knock. In this book, he has recorded times of several locomotive runs and speeds reached. Number 6164, Earl Beatty, is said to have gone over 70 miles an hour a few times throughout a regular run. It seems to me they didn't struggle in the speed department at all. In September of 1946, the last of the class to be built would be the first to be withdrawn. The next year, 4 of the remaining 5 engines would be withdrawn. The final engine was the lone B3/3, surviving into April of 1949. Though it was nearly a new engine at this point, its habit of breaking its frames made it undesirable. Adding to that, it was entirely unique, and so not at all worth repairing. None of the class were saved. As far as lifespan goes, the first of the class lived the longest, at 30 years and 1 month. The rest of the class fell short of the 30-year mark by up to 4 years. There's a fantastic picture of number 6165, Valor, possibly fresh out of the works. Its tender and outside cylinders look a bit small for it, but the engine itself has this heavy, refined appearance. The B3s were powerful engines when they were built, but a mixed traffic class based off of them was vastly more successful, and not long later there was a huge selection of 460s just as fast and just as powerful. They didn't last very long compared to other 460s, and the most notable member of the class was arguably the one that broke itself. None of them survived, and as far as I'm aware, there are no plans for a new build or anything of the like. The Great Central Railway 9P was an unremarkable class, plagued with a number of small issues. Interesting from a historical perspective, and a mechanical one as well. But never once was this class the best at anything it did. I'd say, just like the B2s I did a video on recently, they weren't exactly failures. They were acceptable for their time, and if they were that bad, none of them would have made it to 30 years. But even after Gresley rebuilt 4 of them, they weren't impressive. They sort of blended into the background right up until their non-standard nature made them stand out. And then, they were thrown out. I don't think a new build with this type would be viable. The 4 cylinders make for a complex machine, they're coal-hungry, and not as well proportioned as other 460s. Add to that their relatively low power output compared to younger express engines, and their considerable weight, it just doesn't seem worth it, at least not yet. Coal consumption is a huge concern right now in the UK, and the 9P consumes a lot of it. Perhaps when oil firing technology becomes more common over there, it'll be more realistic, but a 9P isn't worth it at the moment. The 9P was meant to be an express engine, and served most of their lives on secondary service. Some would argue they're hardly worth remembering, but remembering the weird and unremarkable